Welcome to the D6 Family Ministry Podcast, a place where ideas, principles, and personalities come together to give you a ministry advantage that empowers the church and home.
I don't know anything more important in our society or in the kingdom of God than to help the church, help the family.
Discipleship is not an event, it's a way of life.
And one day it just hit me that discipleship at home was not about doing more. It was about inviting Christ into what we were already doing.
The goal of family ministry is not families sitting on the couch holding hands and singing Kumbaya. The ultimate goal is families that love God, love people, and make disciples of all peoples.
So that's why you're here. You're here to say 1 hour a week, as significant and as awesome as it is, we know that it's not enough, and we want to be intentional with every hour.
You're listening to the D6 Podcast. Here are your hosts, Marianne Howard, Ron Hunter, and Josh Wooten.
Well, hello, guys. Well, I am really excited about our guest today, and I got to tell you, this has been one of the most powerful podcasts for my own walk with Jesus. 7 pages of notes and lots of pausing and writing and crying. So I want to just say to the Mattsons, thank you for your vulnerability and your wisdom, and God really has used it. I'm excited for our listeners to hear just what you're about to drop on them. You just cover so many different things, and I'm very excited about this. One of the things that they talk about in this interview is their favorite cereal. And so I'm going to throw this question out. Do you have a favorite cereal, and what is it?
Oh, goodness. In my old age, I have, it used to be stuff like honeycombs or chocolate Rice Krispies, Cocoa Krispies. Yes. But now I gravitate towards Cinnamon Life, and my kids shame me, but I like Cinnamon Life.
Yes.
Well, you may get shame. I get chuckles. I'm on the road traveling in a normal season. It hasn't been normal lately. But at the Hampton Inn, which is my go-to hotel, I'll go down for breakfast in the morning. And if I look into the hot tray and I don't like what they're serving, my go-to is Fruit Loops. And I love Fruit Loops to this day. And I can eat them with milk or without milk. It doesn't really matter. I can take the box to go and just munch on them in the car. But I'll grab 2 boxes of Fruit Loops in the Hampton Inn, and I am a happy camper.
Josh, your wife introduced me to Cinnamon Life last year, and I love that stuff. It is so good. It's a go-to for me. I could clear a box in 3 days.
Cinnamon Life is life.
And it can go with milk or without. And that's the sign of a true good cereal. But recently, Dude Perfect, if you guys are familiar with Dude Perfect, I have boys and they're big with my age boys. Dude Perfect has me on to Honey O's.
Honey O's are
good.
And
I'm going to tell you, when you see the box of Honey O's, you're not so sure what the hype is. But when you open the box, you smell the box, and you pour that box into the bowl, there is nothing like Honey O's.
I'm confused. When you said Honey O's, I thought the Honey Nut Cheerios. That's not what you're referring to.
No.
Describe this for us.
It's okay. It's an O, but it has sugar and brown sugar and nuts in the O.
Okay. I'm looking at a picture right now of it on Google.
Now, the box is not, it's really not that flashy. Okay.
No.
But I'm going to tell you guys, on the inside of that box is a treat. So please try Honey O's. It is now my most favorite cereal.
And to set the record straight, a moment ago, when I said 2 boxes, I don't mean big boxes. I'm talking individual serving boxes. After I heard Marianne go, I can clear a box in 3 days, and I just admitted to 2 boxes each morning. We need to clarify how big these boxes are.
Yeah, mine's Cinnamon Life, but I did just text my wife, who is at the store currently, to bring home a box.
Bring home some
Honey
money. I could tell you were doing something else there.
I'm just texting Honey O's, please. She's probably like, "What are you talking about?" So I had to follow it up with a second text. I'm talking cereal, baby.
Well, I'm thrilled about our guest today, and you're going to want a pen and paper and maybe even some tissue. And this is for the parent. This is for the ministry leader, the pastor's wife. If you've faced trauma of any kind, if you're walking through trauma right now, I feel like the whole world has walked through trauma in recent days. And so I just would encourage you to just really sit and absorb truth and wisdom that is about to come in this conversation.
Not only are the Mattsons very, very powerful, and we get the ability to absorb this in whatever our podcast environment or preference is, but the Mattsons represent the caliber of speakers that you're going to find at the D6 conference. And I don't know about you, but I'm ready to meet again. I'm ready for us to get together as a community of believers face to face and have a chance to listen to the caliber of speakers like you're getting a chance to hear on the D6 podcast, but all in one setting over about a 3-day period, mixing up main stage, mixing up the breakouts. We have nearly 70 breakouts, and we have 10 to 12 main stage speakers. And then you get the community that you can plop down in different places and just enjoy each other. You know, we've been cooped up for a long time. And this is one of the first major conferences that will give you a chance to come together, you and your team, or maybe you and your family, and in Orlando the first week of April. So go to d6conference.com, check it out, check out all the speakers we have, and let's get back together and start focusing on what we can do for our family and for our family ministry and the discipleship of all generations in your church. When we come back from this break, we're going to hear from the Mattsons, and we'll debrief on the other side.
Are you looking for the right conference to attend this year? The D6 Conference is a family ministry conference designed for your entire ministry team. Come hear from over 30 speakers and network with churches that share your passion for reaching families. Family ministry isn't just another program. It's one of the most important things your church can do to make a difference in your city. At the D6 Conference, you'll be inspired and equipped to take your family ministry to the next level. To learn more about the D6 Conference, just go to d6conference.com.
Right now, I am joined by Jeff and Terra Mattson. With Jeff as an executive leadership coach and Terra as a licensed therapist, the Mattsons have invested more than 2 decades in leadership coaching and trauma-informed therapy and have helped national organizations and churches navigate difficult leadership crises. The Mattsons bring their unique experience and wisdom to their first book together, Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live. Jeff and Terra, thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, David, for having us.
Well, I want to jump in and talk about your book, Shrinking the Integrity Gap. Very fascinating book and very fascinating concept with an integrity gap. For our listeners out there, can you explain what an integrity gap is?
Well, maybe first, just talking about our thoughts about integrity. Lots of books have been written and articles and things about and definitions for integrity. We just really think it's kind of a lumper. It really is all your relationships. It's your thinking, your behavior, the words you use, just really a person's whole being, if you will. Hopefully moving in a singular and from our worldview, a biblical or a Christ-like direction, right? And that does not mean perfection, because only Christ didn't have what we call the integrity gap. So we're all on a journey here. And integrity is not, it's not a decision that a person makes about themselves. It's not an event. You know, they don't go to a conference or a seminar and are integrous all of a sudden. It's a lifestyle every day, all day long of choices. And there's ebbs and flows in that, right? The gap, to answer your question, comes from this. It comes from the distance between what we preach about, you know, what we say, what we believe, who we are, and actually then how we live, you know, and for every human, and this is a human condition, we have a challenge with the gap, and it's a noble pursuit to shrink that thing down. And from a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview, he's helping us in that.
Yeah, you mentioned that every human deals with that. Now, in an ideal world, that wouldn't be the case, and I would love to think that I don't have a single integrity gap in my life, but that's just not true, and that's the same as it is for everybody that lives. What's the risk when leaders don't see or address their integrity gaps?
The risk is huge. Really, what we're trying to say is it's not necessarily living without a gap. It's shrinking it and getting our baggage down to carry-on size. And so the risk is the more that we're unaware of our gaps, the more that we dismiss our gaps, and the more that we just plow through our leadership and our lives without addressing them, it not only harms our own walk with God, our walk with our most important relationships, but every single person that is watching us in our wake of influence. When a leader lives with integrity, everybody in their wake benefits. But when they lack integrity, everyone in their wake pays. And it's just a matter of time. So we're really trying to call attention to leaders who are more aware of of those gaps. And then just that posture of continually shrinking it.
You talk about trauma in your book, and that's something that's not always comfortable for people to talk about, but it's something we need to talk about. What is the link between trauma and gaps of integrity?
Yeah, I'll start, and then Jeff, you add on. The link we found is that with high capacity leaders, we're often used to living with great intensity. Our buckets are larger, and oftentimes you'll find with trauma survivors, if you define trauma, basically it's anything out of the ordinary. So that broadens the definition to recognize that there's a lot of things that happen in our life that we minimize, but should be calling trauma in the way that it impacts our brain. Trauma is stored in the body. And so the response to trauma often is one of two ways. We either become victims, ongoing victimization, or ongoing overperformance. And we try to outsmart the costs of trauma. And that ends up looking like high capacity, high performer leaders. And all of us that are in that category have to really do an honest look at, are we running from our pain through high performance and achievement? Or is it a response to understanding our stories and actually living out of the fruit of what God's doing? And it's a fine line for a lot of us. And we start to see that it becomes more obvious the longer we've been in leadership.
Yeah, and I just think that that high capacity for leaders to take on and tasks and work towards achievement, achievement is wonderful in and of itself. There's nothing wrong with it.
Yeah.
But if we're using it, whether we know this or not, conscious or unconsciously, as a means of coping, as putting pain and challenge from our past away, we're leaking. It doesn't go away unless it's addressed, and it takes time. So our encouragement to leaders is really, and over the last couple decades, really has been working with them to understand where's the root level issues as it relates to the symptoms that they're presenting, the things that they want to work on, or the challenges that they've got. Many, many cases, high capacity leaders that we work with, we find trauma that's either been minimized. Again, why? My past, what does my past have to do with my present or my future? I mean, that's a common leader response, male or female. And that is a huge tell to us that they've minimized and compartmentalized things in the effort to overcome. And but yet they don't know why they can't seem to deal with their anger problem, at the same time. And they may really want to deal with the anger problem. They just don't know where it's coming from, right? It's coming from earlier times, and we got to go back.
Yeah, I want to kind of camp out there for a second. Jeff, you mentioned that compartmentalization and those coping strategies. And when we have that pain in our lives, it's really easy to turn to coping strategies or numbing or some type of escapism. Sometimes it can be the small things, like the other night I just tore through a box of Cinnamon Toast Crunch because I was stressed. Not healthy, but could be worse. But there are times where it does become much worse. Why are those strategies and that coping, that numbing, why is that all so detrimental? And what's the alternative?
Well, there's a couple things we could say to that. Is we all have coping strategies, and the line is whether they're the healthier version or the unhealthy version. And we justify all kinds of things that maybe aren't as bad as that coping strategy, right? Workaholism produces really amazing results in our lives, but it can have some major side effects on our health, on our relationships. And so it's really, I think as Christians, we often focus too much on the coping strategies. We try to look at the behavior and then do what we call sin management, right? Where it's a matter of like white knuckling our way through life of quit doing that, quit eating cinnamon toast crunch at 11 o'clock at night. And really we're saying there's always something, and those are just weeds. And there's roots that are playing a role in that. And so when a weed is starting to choke out the life of who we are and who God designed us to be, that's when it's a problem. And so I struggled with bulimia for years. That's kind of on the really unhealthy side of coping, with some really deep emotional scars that I was dealing with. However, when I got rid of the bulimia, I moved to over-exercise and counting my calories too much. Now, was it an eating disorder? No, but it was still that extreme regimen of focusing too much on what I could control on the outside. Now I eat freely, and if I don't exercise, I'm good to go. But I use exercise as a means, again, of living a healthy life, not to cope with the pain of my life.
I just grab a big old bowl and I pour my golden grams in there.
You guys share that in common.
And it's a little comfort. It could be worse.
Are you looking for a way to equip families to do discipleship in their own homes? D6 Everyday offers a new at-home bundle option, so you can reach families where they are. The same great D6 Everyday resources now bundled to fit your family. D6 Everyday at-home bundles are a great way to promote discipleship at home, especially during COVID-19 restrictions. Many churches and small groups are not gathering for worship or discipleship training, but you can resource them with teaching helps for the parents and devotion magazines for every member of the family, or about the cost of a Chick-fil-A meal. For more information, visit d6everyday.com.
We are back with Jeff and Terra Mattson. Before the break, we were talking about Golden Graham Cinnamon Toast Crunch, but we were also talking about how we often try to escape our painful realities. Why do you think Christians have such a hard time, especially Christian leaders? Why do we have such a hard time being honest about our personal struggles?
Yeah, it's an interesting piece that we think it's complex. And to answer that question, so we'll just kind of dabble a little bit here. But one of the issues is this, of course, as humans, we're prone to hero worship and placing people on pedestals. As Christians, we're equally prone to that, maybe even more prone to that in some respects, even though we would say only Jesus is worthy of worship, right? It's like, so here's an integrity gap that we have to work with in the church, capital C and lowercase c. And another aspect of this is the fact that we so there's the temptation to hero worship. The culture of forgiveness, the culture of grace, and these are beautiful things that exist within the church that God has given us. However, what we can do is we can start minimizing or using these things. If we're further down the journey where our integrity gap is great, we can start using, we see even a lot of leaders and healthy leaders using those things in the church to hide, to keep people at bay, and to abuse, right? So keeping up appearances is a challenge in general for people and for leaders. There's the internal pressure, especially with leaders in the church, of course, so we're doing kingdom work, right? And because we're doing kingdom work, it's like, and that's supposed to be, and we take scriptures out of context where we're supposed to focus so much on that, and even the hyperbole of hating your mother or father and your brother and your sister to pursue the kingdom work and the things of God. We get all mixed up and twisted in that. We get lost in that, right? And we can start escaping even in church, right? Where we're people look to us as the lead pastor or the whatever it might be, and yet at home there's no relationship with your kids or wife or husband if you're a female minister, right? So it's like, my gosh, the temptations to keep all of this going, and if you continue on that journey of trying to keep up those appearances, it's going to get more intense, and you're going to be more driven to now keep this image up, and it's God's reputation's on the line somehow. Yeah. Even though He's quite capable of taking care of His own reputation.
I also want to add a little compassion, not that you weren't being compassionate, Jeff, but a little compassion to the fact that it's complex as leaders. The more relationships we have, right? So let's take just a pastor, for example. They're not only brothers and sisters with their colleagues, but they're also their employer. And then they have Christmas and Thanksgiving together, and then, they raise their children, and then, I've actually done premarital counseling for your daughters. And so we call those dual relationships in the clinical world. And in the business world, it's a little bit more all or nothing, it's just business.
Separation.
But in the church, we have too many complex overlapping relationships. So when one string gets pulled, it affects so many more. So we end up feeling the tension to want to hide that a little bit more, I think.
Well, talking about this kind of makes me think about those who are leading during the pandemic. And I'm guessing when you first had the idea for this book, there probably was no pandemic. And yet I'm reading the book and I'm thinking, okay, God knew what was about to happen. And this book seems like it's aimed for ministers so well during this pandemic. I've talked to so many pastors recently, and they say they're discouraged, they're depressed, they're lonely, they're confused. And I often hear them say, I'm just trying to do the best that I can, but I don't even know what I'm supposed to do. How can our pastors and our leaders make sure that they're taking care of themselves during this time?
Yeah, if we're speaking to them, having been in pastoral ministries together, we understand. And we wrote this book to encourage and actually inspire, to help guard hearts and protect hearts, and in healthy ways, right? And no matter where you are at in your journey, but my gosh, you're right. The circumstances are so challenging right now. You don't have a choice to isolate. You're being isolated, right? Which is one of our symptoms that all leaders are vulnerable to, right? It's yet how do you combat that? It's with the avenues in which you can. Just would say this is a time and a season where we're leaning into our awesome God, the source of our supply. And we're shrinking our integrity gap as we learn to trust him more. He's not wasting that. As we literally learn to trust him more with our livelihoods, with our relationships, with everything, right? And what does that look like? It means releasing control, keeping him on the throne where only he sits, and asking him for help to meet our needs in healthy ways and to show up for us in ways that we need him to show up. And, I remember being in pastoral ministries, and I would lend a lot of hope. Every Sunday it was like game day, right? And you left all on the court. And many of the pastors and ministers that are listening to this are going to feel that way, right? I would get in my car at the end of both services that we would have, and I would sit in my car. I would say things to people when I was, in the service with parents and with kids, and just encouraging them and trying to support them and remind them of what the things were true about God and about who he saw them to be. I'd get in my car and I'd just be totally empty. And I would say, Lord, I hope I was faithful to you today in casting an accurate picture of who you are and what you say about people that I interacted with today. But I would be like, God, what about my family? What about the family challenges that I'm experiencing? What about the things like how I need you to show up in there, right? In this season in COVID, there's just a lot of discouragement. A lot of things have been taken away. And this really is hard. It also is an opportunity for us to turn towards the one that can meet our needs and to get those needs met in healthy ways, and to link arms with a few people so that we're doing it in community as best we can. And that's what I would say.
And I would just add that I think it just reminds us of our limitations and our humanity. And I think as leaders, we often lose touch with that. We start believing our own press and everybody else telling us they need us, or we think they need us. And these times, particularly during the pandemic, remind us that how small we are. And as a leader, I think many can resonate. That's so healing to know, like, God is the God of the universe and I don't have to be. And so recognizing that God is meeting the needs of our sheep, those that are following us, even when we can't. And so just really being honest, and I think not honest with ourselves, but also honest with our followers, people that are leaning to us, and just being very real during this time. I think they appreciate it. And more than ever, I think as leaders, we need to be doing that.
Well, there's no doubt that this discussion shines a light on the topic of mental health. I heard someone say the other day, and it really bothered me, but they said God doesn't care about your emotional well-being. And I thought that's the kind of stuff that really damages people, and it causes the stigma, and it causes leaders to not seek help. And we already know it's especially tough for male leaders and male leaders in the church to seek help, because sometimes we view that as emotional weakness or even spiritual weakness. Terry, with you being a licensed professional in this, and I'm so thankful that you are, what advice would you give to leaders, or how can leaders get the help they need, especially when they feel like maybe I shouldn't get help, or maybe it's wrong to get help, or I don't want people to know that I'm getting help?
Okay, so I would say three things to that. The first is the very foundation of our faith as believers is we need help. It's number one. So if you recognize that is the first submission of God, I can't do this life on my own, I need you, then you are recognizing that getting help is a part of God's design. And part of God's design is not just help from him, but he created this horizontal relationship community dynamic. We're made in the image of a triune relational God. We need each other. The second thing is the neuroscience proves again and again and again that when we stunt our emotional health, we're stunting every other part of who we are. And God was the designer of our bodies and the way that he connected the dots there. And so if we ignore our emotional part, we're ignoring a huge part of the scriptures. I cannot read the scriptures without seeing mental health everywhere as they're being honest and crying out and saying, I can't do this. I'm depressed. I want to end my life. My enemies are after me. Honesty before God and trusting him, and then getting help and receiving help. And part of getting mental health help, so going to a counselor, an executive coach, or a spiritual director, it provides a sacred confidentiality for us to practice as leaders that sometimes is a protection that we need because we haven't quite been able to sort through our own vulnerabilities before we take that to a greater population, our colleagues, our organizations, or those that we're leading. So sometimes that is the best place to start. It isn't where you end. But as professionals, it's why I started a ministry, but I went into counseling, resisting it every step of the way. Jeff can attest to it. And I just thought, these counselors are kooks. That's so judgmental, by the way. But it didn't resonate with me. And the more that I learned and the more that I rubbed shoulders with professional counselors, the more I realized they've got something on the corner of the market that is informing our spiritual formation and discipleship that is more holistic and I think honoring to what God designed.
Yeah, there are a lot of poor counselors out there in the world, and there's no denying that. We're trying to make a small dent in that by bringing that into integrating the wisdom mental health and the neuroscience is so cool. It just reveals what God did.
Yeah.
It's revealing it like crazy right now. It's awesome. Neuroplasticity, the way the brain heals. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to come alongside the church, capital C and local C, right, to help educate from them to be a little bit more, how do you say this, trauma-informed theology, right? Just to have, so that we're not adding abuse and pain and others, right? We have the right motive. So many leaders in the church have the right motive, but in telling someone that's been abused or has experienced severe trauma, like just get into an accountability group, right? Or maybe is dealing with an addiction to pornography, like, hey, we're going to meet one-to-one, and that's awesome, but that's not just the answer. There's so much else going on there that needs to be attuned to. And I'd say that God is revealing that in neuroscience today, his design and how repair can really happen, so that people of faith can, and anyone really, could have the right motive and then the right method to bring help, practical helps to people that they care about.
But you mentioned those that are in the church who have been hurt, and unfortunately, there are those sitting in the pews who have been hurt by leaders. How can those who have been hurt begin to heal and not be forever plagued by those circumstances?
That's so good. I think the biggest piece is to tell your story to one or two other trusted people. What we found from the neuroscience is it's not what happens to you that matters most and what leaves PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's actually whether you receive comfort and care on the other side of that. So have you been able to tell your story and receive a listening ear, empathy, and to be able to actually grieve it, not just set it on the shelf. And too often, those who have been harmed in the church get dismissed again and again, or they're not sure where to go except outside the church. And we're trying to say, no, there are people within the body who love God and love the bride of Christ, who still call that wrong, that's not okay. And so to tell your story in a confidential place and to actually grieve it. And then and you have to name those offenses and name who those people are, and then to move through that process of forgiveness. Just forgiving without naming and grieving doesn't give us the full healing. And that's why we keep finding ourselves still bitter, resistant, not trusting.
Well, this question may kind of seem like it's coming out of left field to our listeners, but it goes along with what we're talking about. And I feel like this is so important to ask you. Sometimes churches don't do the best job of vetting potential hires and leaders. Your book, you mentioned that we often have a forgive and forget mentality that leaves our churches vulnerable. What practical nuts and bolts steps do our churches need to take to ensure the safety of their people?
That's a great question. And thank you for asking it, because boy, we really want to see more churches take that seriously. One, I would, not to freak anybody out, but just the reality is that predators are grooming the church. Mm-hmm. Terra was a part of an article in Christianity Today a long time ago about that very problem. And there are more predators in our church, capital C, small c, than we ever would know. So in the hiring processes, right? And I'm not saying that every person is a predator, right? So hopefully you understand that too, right? I'm thinking, but you also have people who are stuck in behavior scenarios that have not dealt with their baggage, that hide it really good, and you don't know it. And they're not predators, but maybe they're dealing with a drinking problem, or maybe they're dealing with pornography, and no one knows. And they are guarding that and compartmentalizing and trying to work on it and trying to overcome it. And but they're stuck in it. And in the vetting process of a hiring for, let's say, a children's pastor, you don't go to those kinds of questions, or churches ask such broad questions about, is there anything in your life right now that we need to know about, and they don't take into consideration that really we're all broken, and we need to be thinking and asking more poignant questions that are trauma informed, so that we can ensure that say, a candidate applying for a particular role, children's pastor, that's quietly dealing with a pornography addiction and thinks that every man or woman is dealing with that, so they minimize it. No, they in the interviewing process, in the process of getting to know that person, that maybe that's brought to the attention, and that it's not a you can't be involved here in this community. It's not a go get yourself fixed, I'm sorry, you're out of here. It's finding a place where you can receive help and wholeness. They may not place you in that position right there. It might not be an immediate hire, because there's vulnerabilities there, right? And we just need to get educated about what people are really dealing with, and not get responsive to the impulse that I think people have of filling seats, the pressure to fill the seats because the demand is there, and it's all hands on deck. We're always behind. Let's just get someone in there, assume the best of the person, or be attracted to charisma and flash and gifts, right? I think the church is really guilty at just getting sucked into that and be like, oh yeah, you're now in charge of marriage ministries because you are a couple, you guys look great, you got kids, it seems like you've been married long enough, and now that's you. Well, that might not be the best option, right? When you start understanding that couple may be dealing with some serious issues, so we just have a tendency to just go and respond on demand and impulse and flash, and we just need to get a little bit more grounded in prudence and sobriety and about the realities of the human condition, ours included.
So nuts and bolts, we put in our own protocols when we're doing hiring. It's slow. When we have a tendency to want to rush something, we remind ourselves like it's meant to be slow on purpose. We have 5 steps. We don't skip those steps, even if our guts like we got to fill a seat. And at anywhere along the way, if there's red flags, we dive into those red flags and we ask more clarifying questions instead of running away. The final part is we actually invite spouses and we understand one another's stories. We want to know your timeline. And that is such a weird part of the process of hiring, but in Christian communities, by the time somebody is going to join us and link arms, we want to know each other's vulnerabilities. We share ours, they share theirs, and then we continue to take that to prayer, and then obviously do the typical references and all of that. But it's, again, this slower process to get to know one another over time, and our references need to be those that somebody's been known for over 5 years plus, because anybody can schmooze anybody for less than 5 years is our understanding from narcissistic and predatory type behaviors.
And it's our commitment. It's our commitment to the higher goal of providing the kind of care that we believe in, right? And we're subjecting ourselves to that same standard, right? That we would ask anybody else to go into in that way. And so that's part of creating environments of truth and grace that not only deal with it on a preventative end, but also on, if something was to come up, it's a space, because we're not going to be shooting each other, at which I think Christians are terrible at doing, right? We're living in that clarity that we're all that we have a fallen nature, and that we can grow in environments of truth and grace, rather than you're struggling, see ya.
Yeah.
For our listeners out there, I would say this part of the book alone is worth its price, because this is such an important topic. Jeff shares a story in the book about being on staff with somebody who wasn't who they said they were. I've had that same experience of being on staff with somebody who they weren't who they said they were. And if you're not willing to pay up front and take the time up front, you will pay for it in the end, and it will be damaging. And so that's kind of my little soapbox here, but the information they have in the book is just it's priceless when it comes to issues like this, especially when we're dealing with people and we're dealing with children. Towards the end of the book, you talk about confession. It's a very prominent theme throughout your entire book. Toward the end, you write, "If we do not confess, we will lose everything. It's just a matter of time." Now, talk about convicting. I mean, that's like a kick in the stomach right there. What role does confession play in shrinking our integrity gap?
Let's just start with the fact that I hear this often. I do confess. God knows everything. And honestly, I think a lot of listeners would say, yes, I do. I read a journal. I tell him everything. But part of what God's word says is to confess to one another. Whew, that's the harder part.
You may be healed.
And then you may be healed. So we're forgiven from a theological place. We're forgiven when we confess to the Lord. But the healing process, again, that neuroscience, the way He designed us, and that freedom to say, is there a few people in my life who know everything about me? And what's so profound when we start to confess and tell the whole story of who we are, there's significant healing that happens in our brains, in our hearts, in our bodies, in our relationships, and we start to be able to actually like ourselves again. That divided life that happens inside of the inner voices of, if you really knew me, you wouldn't love me, like me, see me, all the shame that people hold. Those whispers start to die when we confess to one another.
Yeah, and there's this tremendous freedom that comes from not having hiddenness. I just think about that for a while if you're listening to this. And I have to think about that a while, even as I say it. I mean, just that there's wonderful freedom. I've tasted, I know what this freedom is like. And when you don't have hiddenness, you're able to recoup all the energy that you waste hiding now towards things that God wants to do in your life and the new territory that He's taken you in. And it's a wonderful thing. The cost is great, though, and we don't want to minimize the cost, right? We think about a journey that a person goes on. Here's where we draw out David and Saul, and that comparison has been brought out in a lot of ways over a lot of time. But just look, both were leaders, right? Both were fallen men and made mistakes, significant mistakes in sin. Both had consequences. And both had to live out the consequences of their sin. God didn't remove the consequences. And yet the difference was their heart's response, right?
Mm-hmm.
Saul tried to hide and minimize, and David, he owned it. I mean, it was confess and repent, and yet he still had to live out those consequences. He still lost his job, and that's hard to understand how that was a part of the consequence, but it still happened, and there were other consequences, and he had sons that wanted to kill him, and generationally. So I think that that hopefully touches on what you asked.
Yeah, and that's such a tough thing with confession, because I'm reading your book and I'm reading confess. I'm like, yep, got it. To one another. I don't know about that. And that's where our human nature comes in. But I like what you said. There is great freedom when that happens. And that's confessing to one another is being true to Scripture. God wasn't making a mistake when he put that in our Bibles. So that's very, very good. Well, let's get you guys out on this. We're talking about shrinking the integrity gap. How do the principles of that apply to leadership at our homes?
Well, there's if you have kids, they're gonna keep it real, and you can't. You may be able to get away with being awesome outside the house, right? That's one of the chapters we talk about. Some of the subtitles is like, everybody loves me outside of my house. How does this play? I mean, if you're trying to shrink your integrity gap and you really are trying to integrate, again, and every person would say, I don't know a good dad or a good mom that would say that, I wouldn't take a bullet for my wife or my kids or my husband or whatever. I mean, in a moment, die for them, right? Like that's said all the time. Well, how are you dying every day, to the other? In a sense, giving up yourself, selfishness, to love and to serve in a sacrificial way, right? How is that happening every day, right? Mm-hmm. And so, one of the practical things that we were just reminded of even just yesterday is the fact that, like, when we get into an argument, we're both firstborns, we're kind of passionate.
We're feisty.
We both feel strongly about convictions. And we've got 2 daughters, soon to be 14 and now just 12. And if they're in the house hearing mom and dad do this, and they got their eyes are big, like, are they okay? Mom and dad okay? And, we can, the encouragement to bring them in to say, gosh, our voices are loud right now. Mm-hmm. Girls, how is this making you feel? Like bringing them in to process, help them understand what the process is that's going on here. Mom and dad aren't getting a divorce because we're yelling or our tones are louder and we're both strong in our conviction. We just are having a disagreement about something, but bring them in and teach them the how is something that we were just reminded of, as opposed to just dealing with content.
And then they have to see us asking forgiveness, which is easy to miss that part, but to actually let them see us reconcile. It might take a day or two, in all our humanity, right? But just to say that we did close up that loop. Mom and dad were frustrated with each other, as you as sisters get frustrated. But here's what we did this morning. We had a conversation. We asked forgiveness. We moved through it. We have understanding. Will you forgive us for getting loud in front of you guys? That doesn't feel good. So it's this bringing what we would teach, right? What we would preach, what Jeff and I teach other couples, right. And going, are we doing that too?
That's right.
And so it's this great, it's humbling, it's sobering, and our children, the generational sin that the scriptures talk about and we see day in, day out in our counseling offices will continue if we do not really engage our kids and ask them, how are we impacting you? What are you seeing? I've often asked my girls, do you think that what you hear Daddy and I teaching others, tell me a place where you think we're missing it in our home. I don't want to hear their answer, but I know I need to hear their answer. And that's part of keeping it real. And the older they get, the more honest they are. And it's good. It's really good.
Bringing them into the process is so good for us too, because what's our goal, right? That they would grow and be stronger in emotional health, and spiritual, physical health, and like as much as possible, right? Any good parents desires that their kids would be just flourishing as and launched right into adulthood. It's no guarantees here, but we want to give it our very best, right? And so we're trying to give the very best that we've got to those that we love the most. That's also a part of shrinking the integrity gap. How often is it that leaders will try to pour out their very best efforts all day long at work or wherever they are with other people that they love a lot less than they espouse to love their significant others, in their home.
Well, the book is called Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live, and there is so much good and practical stuff that you will unpack from that book. You can also hear more from Jeff and Terra at livingwholehearted.com. Jeff and Terra, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us, David.
Well, if you're with us, you are probably needing just a moment of silence just to absorb this. Maybe you push pause multiple times through this just to think through what you have been challenged with. And it was a longer interview, so we're not going to spend a ton of time debriefing it, but it would be an injustice for us not to address some of the items that we discovered along the way. I don't mind hitting one item in here, and then I'm going to toss it to you, but I was blown away with how many times we, and I got to say we, have not dealt with our baggage. And they gave several things that we do with it. We guard it, we compartmentalize it, we minimize it. And then they gave the illustration of the difference between David and Saul, two leaders. And obviously my ears perked up when they applied leadership. And oftentimes the loneliness of leadership, whether it's in ministry or business, we sometimes guard our baggage much more tightly than other people around us for many, many reasons. And there's a huge difference with how God blessed and how God judged the one who hid versus the one who openly confessed and dealt with it. I found that to be very powerfully convicting. What was what did you see in there as a takeaway? Maybe it was this one, maybe it was something else that you want the leaders to really pay attention to on the other side of this interview.
I think it's really, we've all seen and fallen victim to, probably in some way, shape, or form, idolizing or hero worship or pastor worship in a certain church or setting, somebody you looked up to, and we've seen them fall and fail. And I've personally been hurt in situations like that. But the importance they shared of being, it had the integrity of being open and transparent and honest. And one of the most powerful sermons I've ever heard is actually one that wasn't given. I had a former pastor share that he was in a church one Sunday morning, and the pastor stood up in front of the congregation and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not going to be able to speak to you this morning." He goes, "Me and my wife had some differences before I came here, and she's at home crying, and I'm going to leave right now to go home and be with my wife. And I'm going to ask so-and-so to get up here and speak." And walked right out of the back of the church. And to me, that's one of the most powerful sermons as a pastor.
Yeah.
Because so often we can get chasing high capacity leadership and the word hustle is admired. But the truth is our family is our first church, people that we need to be taking care of in our home. And so it was just powerful to me, the importance of that.
Wow.
Kind of along those same lines, I just walked away challenged about their holistic perspective of forgiveness and confession. I have a saying, and I say it to my students a lot: if you don't want anyone to know, tell someone. If you don't want anyone to know, tell someone. And I think that is an important thing for us to remember when it comes to confession. And they said you're forgiven when you confess to God. You're healed when you confess to one another. And they quoted the scripture from James that says, "Confess to one another, and then you may be healed." And I have never put those two together. I don't know why, but when I listened to this, it just became a huge light bulb went off in my heart of the holistic perspective of forgiveness. Is you're forgiven the moment you ask Jesus for forgiveness, but you're healed when you confess to one another, when you name it out loud to someone. And they talk about sacred confidentiality. That was a term that I really loved, that you should have sacred confidentiality, that you've got that close group of people that you can confess to. And I love those people in my life. I have someone that I confess to regularly, and it's so crazy. I called her after this podcast to confess some things that God's dealing in my heart with. And she said, "Put your stick down." And that is just so powerful that the Lord is so gentle through his people to say, stop beating yourself up. That's what's waiting on the other side of forgiveness is healing, and how God can powerfully remind us we're beating ourselves up with shame. And he says, you're forgiven. That's the power when you invite someone into your mess. There is freedom that's waiting on the other side of that. And they said this, and I want our leaders to really hear this. When you confess one to another, it says you recoup all the energy it takes to hide. There is freedom that comes from not having hiddenness. You recoup all that energy that you're using to hide when you say it out loud. That's transforming.
Again, I just think we need time to pause and absorb this. We don't need to rush through this. This is too good. Well, maybe this is one of those podcasts that has touched you on a deeper level. And maybe there's a phrase or two that's jumped out at you that either the Mattson said or Josh or Marianne or I have challenged you with. And if that's the case, here's what I would ask you to do that's different from previous podcasts. Let 2 or 3 days go by while you pray about this, while you figure out who you need to talk to, confess to. And after 2 or 3 days, I want you to replay the podcast, especially the Mattson's portion of this, one more time in your life. And then formulate a game plan of who you're going to invite into that inner circle to be part of that accountability that you most need to take those steps moving forward. That could be the most healing, most enriching part of what you do. So we're not going to go further. We're going to just challenge you with that. We're going to leave you with that. And we will pick back up next week with our guest. And that's going to be Paula Say. And I'm not going to go into the introductions at this point. I'm going to leave it for next week because I want you focusing on the content of what we just debriefed over. Praying for you, praying this really resonates with you and that it's making a difference in your home as well as your church.
You've been listening to the D6 Podcast. You can learn more about D6 at d6family.com.